Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is summer 2018. I'm recording this very close to the 1-year anniversary of starting this show, which is very much still in an experimental phase, shall we say. So this one I'm going to have on a fourth controversial document, one that often makes the rounds in the conspiracy circles, but not usually in the hardcore political conspiracy circles. This one is usually contained to ufology or the UFO conspiracy circles. This one is often referred to as just the Brookings Report. It came out in 1960. It is a real document, and it was entered into the 87th Congressional Record in 1961.
United States UFO policy would continue to evolve. Evidence of this would be found in a report hidden in top-secret files of the Federal Archives for more than 30 years. Known in the UFO community as the Brookings Report, it was prepared for both NASA and the United States Congress.
The Brookings Institute report dates from the very end of 1960. And this was something that was conducted on behalf of NASA at the very beginning of the space program to discuss the implications of space travel.
It was led by a psychologist, Donald Michael, team of 6 writers and maybe 60 consultants, including people with good name recognition like Margaret Mead. As you get to the end of the report, there's a page and a half, 2 pages that deal with the possibility of encountering extraterrestrial intelligence. And it addresses many of the issues that concern us today. How will people react? What will it do to the international political system? How will it affect government leadership? Again, very brief, very concise, but very important.
It stated very explicitly that if, for instance, we find evidence of alien artifacts or technology, that this would be a tremendously difficult, traumatic experience for not only global religion, but also the world of science. And indeed, I believe the phrase was, it could result in social disintegration.
Anthropological files contain many examples of societies sure of their place in the universe, which have disintegrated when they had to associate with previously unfamiliar societies, espousing different ideas and different life ways.
The suggestion that was made in this report, incidentally, was that if our space program came up with evidence of alien intelligence or technology, that it might be a good idea not to mention this fact to the public. It might be a very good idea to keep that fact secret.
When War of the Worlds and this panic came about, that was the only thing that the Brookings Report could reference, saying, look, NASA, you have to prepare for this. You have to have some kind of procedure or protocol for if the public does get into sheer panic. You have to be prepared.
To sort of set the scene a little bit here, the first part I did on this was on silent weapons for quiet wars, and I decided that that document was a fraud or a forgery. The second one that I did in this series was on the report from Iron Mountain, which I decided was a hoax, just as the author claimed it to be. The third one was colloquially known as the NASA War document, which is a real document. And these are used in various ways in the conspiracy circles, often referred to without any kind of critical questions being asked about the documents, about their provenance and all of this. So I sort of wanted to bring that approach here to ask harder questions of the documents themselves to sort of interrogate their reality. One of the things that you have to realize is that there are several divisions within the conspiracy theory communities. Often the hardcore political groups don't want to have anything at all to do with the UFO-oriented conspiracy groups, and vice versa. The UFO groups, they will frequently incorporate some of the findings of the hardcore political people, but then they mix it in with this other UFO stuff that the other side doesn't want to associate with in any way, because they think that it removes some of their credibility and whatnot to their claims. In order to set the scene for this document, although it came out in 1960, it's going to be necessary for me to jump around in the timeline quite a bit. So recently we have had President Trump announce the beginning of this thing called the Space Force. And a lot of people have made jokes about it. They laughed about it and all this kind of stuff, but it's interesting the way that the idea for a Space Force goes back a long way. The whole notion of weaponizing space and all that has been very controversial from the very beginning of NASA. In fact, NASA originally was meant to only have peaceful implications, peaceful works in space. That was supposed to limit the warfare capabilities that eventually everybody knows would go there anyway. And really, this will only amount to the public acknowledgement of something that has already secretly been taking place for quite some time. Now, the story, I would like to begin it actually in 2001 with a fellow by the name of Gary McKinnon. Now, McKinnon was a computer systems administrator and quite a good hacker from what I'm able to tell. And he lives in England, and he was charged in 2002 with perpetrating what some have called the largest military computer hack of all time. And he apparently had broken into almost 100 different U.S. military and NASA computer systems. His goal, he said anyway, was to find out if the U.S. knew anything about UFO activity and was suppressing that, and also whether or not they knew anything about free energy technology and were also suppressing that. What he ultimately found once he got inside these systems was a secret program known as Solar Warden. And what he said he found when he was reviewing the Solar Warden material was that it was a naval space fleet program or a naval space command system. He found a whole list of what were called non-terrestrial officers and other lists of people who were fleet-to-fleet transfer officers. The United States wanted to extradite him from the UK, but the UK ultimately refused that extradition, and he is safe to continue living there. He apparently is a sufferer of Asperger's syndrome, and I think that he lives with his mother still. A lot of people have said that the U.S. dropped the pursuit of his prosecution basically because they didn't want to lend any more credibility to his claims than had already gotten out there, in the hopes that the public would simply dismiss it and move on, as it seems most people have. Now, the tie-in here to this series that I'm doing is that the idea for a black budget secret deep space program goes back a long way. In fact, it came up in the second document that I covered the report from Iron Mountain. It mentioned this very idea that if there were to be conditions of peace, they would be able to eliminate that war machine spending, and then they would just dump it into secret black budget off-planet research and investigations. The book for a report from Iron Mountain, which I'll call a document for the purposes of this, said that they should establish a beachhead colony basically on Mars so that they could eventually set up for a trip out to Jupiter, a manned trip to Jupiter. And we do know from other publicly available information that there are all kinds of secret programs being ran. For instance, one that we know about is called the Boeing X-37, which has had, I think, 4 or 5 spaceflight missions now. It's basically a space drone. It supposedly goes up unmanned and sometimes stays up circling the Earth for a year and a half, 2 years even. And this was kept secret for quite a long time. People would see pictures of it and things like that, and they would know that it took off, but they didn't know where it was going or anything like that, and they always keep the payloads of these completely secret. A lot of people suspect that they have been weaponizing space with this Boeing X-37 and the X-37B, which was actually produced as a joint venture between NASA and DARPA. It's been covered in as much detail as you can probably get from Space.com and Air and Space magazine. They've both ran several articles about it, which I will link below. Importantly, too, you will note that the Boeing X-37B was also in compliance with the Air Force, which the Air Force is supposedly going to be more related to this new Space Force command that President Trump has set up, rather than this supposedly pre-existing Solar Warden program that was related to the Navy Space Fleet or the Navy Space Command System. Here I'll read a short section written by George Knapp for a Las Vegas newspaper. So it says here about McKinnon, According to McKinnon, in 2001, while he was searching online for evidence about UFOs, he accessed classified NASA computers a total of 13 times. But instead of evidence of UFOs, McKinnon found files about a secret space program operated by the U.S. Navy. McKinnon says he even found the names of off-planet crew members. Quote, basically, Donna Hare, who had worked for NASA, told him, meaning McKinnon, about specific buildings where they were airbrushing UFOs out of photographs before releasing them for the public for NASA, said Jan Harzen of the Mutual UFO Network. He wanted to go find that stuff, and in his search for that information, this is what he stumbled upon, literally a secret space fleet within the U.S. Navy. And this whole part here about airbrushing UFOs out of photographs and whatnot is something that's constantly put out there by Richard C. Hoagland, who is also important to the very document that I'll be covering in this episode. Now, Richard Hoagland is really important to the story overall because he was one of the people who first brought the Brookings Report to prominence to where so many people, at least in UFO circles, know about it. So Hoagland wrote a book called Dark Mission, The Secret History of NASA, along with a co-author named Mike Barra. And it was supposedly these two who first brought this document back out to prominence to the public, although it had technically been publicly available since it was in congressional records. It's just that no one had actually done anything to make it well known. Hoagland is probably the most prominent person who makes the case for the face on Mars in the Cydonia region. He's been talking about that for many, many years. He believes that the solar system was occupied by an ancient, high-tech alien civilization that was wiped out by some kind of catastrophic event in the past. And he says that the NASA Apollo program was originated in order to send people to the moon because they already knew about these alien civilizations that had supposedly been here, and that it was to go up and look at the artifacts that pre-existed there and to possibly retrieve some of those, bring them back, and then back engineer that material in order to make other advancements for human technology. So instead of the Roswell crash being the source of back engineered technology for one part of the UFO conspiracy community, another part follows this Hoagland line that this stuff was already up on the moon and they went up to get it then. And it's in this way that he attributes the beginning of the whole moon landing hoax theory actually goes back to NASA itself, that NASA has encouraged this idea from the very beginning that if people wanted to believe that there was some kind of conspiratorial thing taking place with NASA and the moon, it would be much better that they believed that humans simply could not go there at all, rather than the idea that they actually knew about alien technology and went there and retrieved it and then came back and did not inform the public about it. In Hoagland's mind, he considers the Brookings Report to be sort of the smoking gun document. He considers it to be the official NASA policy, although it was really just a set of suggestions written up by a group of more than 200 different scientists and experts from all kinds of different fields, which we will review momentarily. The report has a section in it that suggests that if any evidence is found of aliens, say radio signals or artifacts within the solar system itself, or something even more outlandish than that, that this should be kept from the public, because the idea essentially that it comes to is that the public would panic. It would be like H.G. Wells' presentation in 1938 of War of the Worlds, that it would induce panic among the population, or that people would lose confidence in themselves or in their religion or whatever else, and basically society would just sort of crumble based upon this knowledge of some sort of a super advanced, super intelligent species that was far beyond us. However, and probably not much to your surprise, the document itself doesn't actually say that itself. Now, the origins for this began way back in 1958 when Eisenhower started the project known as Mercury. This was to establish the possibility of sending people into space. There are two different printed versions of this. There's one that is about 186 pages, I believe it is, with extensive footnotes, and then there's another version which I will link below so that you can access it, that is 276 total pages long, which resulted apparently from a FOIA request and someone copied it and then transmitted it out over the internet for everyone else to be able to get. But there's also a different and separate 50-page summary text that also exists related to this, a sort of boil down of the text. So the Brookings Institution was consulted with by NASA in order to put out this report. The actual title of it is Proposed Studies on the Implications of Peaceful Space Activities for Human Affairs. And the lead author listed on it is Donald N. Michael. He was a person with a background in physics, social psychology, sociology, and also he was a member of the Club of Rome, which is one of those organizations that always puts out documents about population control, the population panic that you frequently see on the left, and that has turned up actually in all three of the previous documents that we covered on here. Another member who he collaborated with was a Jack Berenson, who was a member of the World Bank and the Council on Foreign Relations, or at least worked in association with them. Raymond Bauer, social psychologist. Richard Meyer, a systems theorist and futurist. Herbert Shepard, an economist, and Herbert Schreiner, another economist. Says that this was a report prepared for the Committee on Long-Range Studies of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Although this document does have a few things that are rather extraordinary, most of it is pretty common fare for policy papers and position statements and things of that nature. However, some of the stuff that it has in it is really interesting outside of the one particular part that we're going to get to. So some of the notable technology anticipations that are listed in this, before any of this was talked about very much in public, was that there would be a future spread of satellite television, that telecommunications would increase dramatically over the upcoming years, that a deep space research program should be instituted with radio wave monitoring and space-based telescopes, that they would also develop increasingly accurate weather modeling. It contemplates the discovery of life on Mars, and that so long as it is of a subhuman level of intelligence, they decide that it would not have a very large psychological impact on people. However, if superintelligence were to be found, that would have unpredictable results. And within one of the footnotes, it links it to H.G. Wells' 1938 radio broadcast of War of the Worlds and the ensuing panic, which actually some other conspiracy theorists claim that too was some sort of an experiment to see how people would react in such a scenario. The most important chapter of this is Chapter 9, and it's pages 202 to 219, but the part that really sets it apart are pages 215 through 217. The important chapter here is titled Attitudes and Values. The specific subsection of this is titled The Implications of a Discovery of Extraterrestrial Life. And it will be important that I go ahead and read this section here. There are parts of this that make me think of Arthur C. Clarke's 2001: A Space Odyssey. So it begins here. Recent publicity given to efforts to detect extraterrestrial messages via radio telescope has popularized and legitimized speculations about the impact of such a discovery on human values. It is conceivable that there is semi-intelligent life in some part of our solar system, or highly intelligent life which is not technologically oriented. And many cosmologists and astronomers think it very likely that there is intelligent life in many other solar systems. While face-to-face meetings will not occur within the next 20 years unless its technology is more advanced than ours, qualifying it to visit Earth, artifacts left at some point in time by these life forms might possibly be discovered through our space activities on the Moon, Mars, or Venus. I would like to see what could survive on Venus given the temperatures and the constant acid rainstorms. If there is any contact to be made during the next 20 years, it would most likely be by radio, which would indicate that these beings had at least equaled our own technological level, which is quite a silly assumption when you think about how radio has developed and basically faded away now in many senses. An individual's reactions to such a radio contact would in part depend on his cultural, religious, and social background, as well as on the actions of those he considered authorities and leaders and their behavior. In turn, would in part depend upon their cultural, social, and religious environment. The discovery would certainly be front-page news everywhere. The degree of political or social repercussion would probably depend on leadership's interpretation of 1, its own role, 2, threats to that role, and 3, national and personal opportunities to take advantage of the disruption or reinforcement of the attitudes and values of others. Since leadership itself might have great need to gauge the direction and intensity of public attitudes to strengthen its own morale and for decision-making purposes, it would be most advantageous to have more to go on than personal opinions about the opinions of the public and other leadership groups. The knowledge that life existed in other parts of the universe might lead to a greater unity of men on Earth, based on the oneness of man or on the age-old assumption that any stranger is threatening. Much would depend on what, if anything, was communicated between man and the other beings. Since after this discovery, there will be years of silence because even the closest stars are several light years away. An exchange of radio communication would take twice the number of light years separating our sun from theirs. The fact that such beings existed might become simply one of the facts of life, but probably not one calling for immediate action. Whether Earthmen would be inspired to all-out space efforts by such a discovery is a moot question. Anthropological files contain many examples of societies sure of their place in the universe, which have disintegrated when they have had to associate with previously unfamiliar societies espousing very different ideas and different life ways. Others that survived such an experience usually did so by paying the price of changes in values and attitudes and behavior. Since intelligent life might be discovered at any time via the radio telescope research presently underway, and since the consequences of such a discovery are presently unpredictable because of our limited knowledge of behavior under even an approximation of such dramatic circumstances, 2 research areas can be recommended. Note, these are only recommendations. These are not official NASA policies. So it's here, points 1 and 2. Continuing studies to determine emotional and intellectual understanding and attitudes and successive alterations of them, if any, regarding the possibility and consequences of discovering intelligent extraterrestrial life. Point 2. Historical and empirical studies of the behavior of peoples and their leaders when confronted with dramatic and unfamiliar events or social pressures. Such studies might help to provide programs for meeting and adjusting to the implications of such a discovery. Questions one might wish to answer by such studies would include: how might such information, under what circumstances, be presented to or withheld from the public, for what ends? What might be the role of the discovering scientists and other decision makers regarding release of the fact of discovery itself? So just that one little line there about the possibility of withholding from the public information leads them to all of these ideas about airbrushing photos and NASA having an official conspiratorial agenda to keep secrets from the public and all of this business. But that is basically it out of almost 300 pages of material and 400 footnotes. That is the warp and woof of the substance of so much conspiracy theorizing about this particular document, the Brookings Report. And I feel that I have to point out here that I am not a debunker. I am not a capital S skeptic. I'm not of the variety of persons such as James Randi or Michael Shermer or someone like that. I actually enjoy conspiracism. I enjoy reading conspiracy theories. I like to catalog them and categorize them and all that sort of thing. But I really wanted to look at these documents because I've heard so much about so many of them over the years, and I wanted to find out, what was the substance there? What is the sort of underlying substrata of what supports many of the conspiracy theories that you hear that still go around today? A lot of these actually became prominent in the early to mid 1990s following Bill Cooper's book Behold a Pale Horse, and then obviously with the work of Richard Hoagland here on his Dark Mission, which was a New York Times bestseller. And Cooper's book likewise was a sort of underground bestseller for many years. And what we have after looking at 4 documents is sort of a mixed bag of results. You have 2 that I think are obviously real documents, and then you have 2 that seem to be quite obviously not real documents. But that doesn't mean that the conspiracy theorists are always wrong. We have a whole list of things that they've been correct about. Their identifications of various secret societies, the prominence and importance of some of these secret societies, which the mainstream media denied they even existed for many years. Now they openly admit that they do exist, but then they downplay the role that these secret societies possibly play within society. But they were also right about the EU, the European Union. They were the first ones who were out there warning that it was about the dissolution of national sovereignty, that it was about the creation of a European superstate to kind of match the United States. And they see it as like this long-term program working toward bringing together several of these superstates, these supranational states, under the auspices of the United Nations way down the road. And you can also see these very same forces are very much aligned against the current rise that we have of nationalism and populism and the sort of rise of a certain brand of the right across the West right now. The mainstream media constantly flips out about it. They can't stand it at all. They will suffer no challenges whatsoever, and they're clearly in an alliance right now with the tech left to start banning people all across the political spectrum that is not in complete agreement with the political left, and that is the far left ideology. That's also why I think it's more important to analyze this stuff more from a historical and philosophical standpoint rather than a conspiracy theory standpoint. The philosophy really gets to the root of the motivation of the people who would be called the globalists and the elite and all this sort of stuff. It's a particular mentality that they all adopt, and a lot of it comes out first in the universities, and then it's taken up by the elites later because they think, well, this is what the smart people say, so to be smart, these are the beliefs that I have to have, and we have to enact these, and everybody has to conform to these so-called smart ideas that the so-called smart people have in the universities. And all of that stuff right now is just sort of warmed over postmodernism mixed with various versions of Marxism and communism and socialism, which is why I actually started this whole process by analyzing socialism and Marxism and various foundational documents related to communism instead of getting into this material, which is perhaps more exciting for some people, but I actually think we need to look more towards philosophy rather than conspiracy. But just to hop back to the NASA-related Brookings Report for just a moment, some of the people who have attacked this whole idea that NASA would have an interest in keeping secret such bizarre things as the findings of alien artifacts and all these supposed airbrush photos and things like that would be this. All of these government institutions want to have more money. They are constantly asking for more funding. Well, what would be the best way to get more funding would be the whole idea that, hey, we found something that may not be of a human creation on the moon or on Mars or something like that. I mean, why would you keep something like that under your hat for so long when you could have access to uncounted billions of dollars if you simply announced one very minor finding? Even a radio signal, you would probably be able to start getting many, many billions of dollars filtered in your direction. And if there is indeed this secret deep space program, which has been suggested for many years, that there's there's a concept known as the breakaway civilization, which would be possibly tied into this whole deep space secret black project material that is supposedly taking place. It was coined, I think, by Dr. Richard Dolan, who's probably written the two best UFO books that I've ever read, known as UFOs and the National Security State, Volume 1 and Volume 2. I'll link those below if you happen to be interested in that sort of material. But Dr. Dolan has been talking about this idea for quite some time now. If there is something like that, I also don't see how it would benefit NASA as a separate institution to not get the funding for being, related to this in some manner. I don't understand why they would be involved in a cover-up like that. And especially if you have this supposedly pre-existing program known as Solar Warden, which is the naval deep space program and all this sort of thing. And then you have President Trump announcing the new Space Force, which I guess would be more related to the Air Force in some means. But ultimately, the question that you have to ask yourself about this in relation to this particular report, the Brookings Report, is how could this document, even if it is a so-called smoking gun document that NASA wants to keep these things secret, cover them up from the public and all this, how can this document actually be binding? From whence does its binding power emanate? That's what I would like to know. Same thing with Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, same thing with Report from Iron Mountain. How does this have any kind of binding power over future administrations? Carter administration, Ford administration, Reagan, Bush, Bush 2, Obama, Trump. I just don't really see how it could have that kind of power over those future administrations. They could simply shelve it, ignore it, move on, adopt some other policy, an alternative approach to things. It's always possible. It's what always happens. And the other thing that you always have to come back to is, what does the empirical evidence say? What do you see? What is it that you can know about? And common sense. What does common sense tell you in relationship to these 4 documents now that we have gone through all of them? And these are just 4 documents among mounds and mounds and mounds of other documents. They're merely the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there are literally hundreds, even thousands of these produced every year, and tens of thousands have been produced since, December of 1960, when we have this first critical document here. But ultimately, it has been really fun taking a look at these documents and thinking about them, thinking about their historical context and the implications that follow from such material. In the next few episodes, I think I'm going to turn a little bit more towards some economic issues, explaining some economic theories that I think are really important, especially among libertarians. Specifically, what I have in mind right now would be some of the work of Dr. Hans Hermann Hoppe. I'm really interested in his work, and I've been reading some of his great material that came out in the late 1980s that is still fascinating today and very, very much applicable to the political environment that we are currently finding ourselves in. The one that I've been reviewing in preparation for this so that I can do the presentation is A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism by Hoppe, and it's sort of Hoppe's response to John Rawls' famous, or rather infamous book now, A Theory of Justice, which is one that most of my fellow libertarians have lots of problems with the argumentation process that Rawls employed. And Hoppe is able to take a lot of that and then sort of turn it in upon itself and basically dismantle the argument. He doesn't really address Rawls directly or specifically. I think he maybe mentions him 1 or 2 times in the book. But essentially it's a takedown of the whole concept of socialism itself and why it is theoretically impossible and in the real world is always doomed to failure. And capitalism is the best system. I prefer to call it the free market, but he uses capitalism in that, so that's what we will stick to. Please subscribe, like, share, and all of that. Thank you.